There was a room beneath Manhattan where no sound escaped, no screams, no prayers, only silence. A silence so absolute, the rats refused to live there. What happened behind that iron door was never written in newspapers, never spoken in courtrooms, and never taught in schools. But it existed, it thrived, and for 31 years it fed on the forgotten. Now you're going to hear what you were never supposed to know. The story of the Murphy family is not a tale of madness, it's a blueprint for institutional terror built not on chaos, but on order, controlled, documented, legally sanctioned, and perfected. In 1836, Manhattan was a pressure chamber. The city was growing faster than anyone could control. Disease in the air, filth in the streets, fire in the soul of every man chasing survival. Religion had become more than salvation, it was law. The church and the courtroom blurred into one, and that was exactly the storm the Murphys had been waiting for. Patrick Murphy did not believe in hell. He believed in control. He'd learned it in Ireland behind the walls of Kilmainham jail, where his job as a prison enforcer taught him one principle: a broken body forgets, but a broken mind obeys. When he arrived in New York, he brought more than scars. He brought a system. He proposed a house of religious correction for women, a place to cleanse society's moral rot. Prostitutes, drunks, adulterers, wives who questioned, daughters who rebelled. He pitched it to judges and priests like a cure. What he built was something else entirely. He purchased a shuttered textile factory on the edge of the Lower East Side, an area already drowning in crime and poverty. Bricked windows, iron gates, 4 stories of red brick rot surrounded by silence. That's where it began. That's where they turned women into shadows. His wife, Kathleen Murphy, had no pity in her blood. In Bow, Stone, she'd supervised Irish workhouses where charity was a weapon. She knew how to mask cruelty in care, how to make pain feel like redemption. To the city, she was a devout reformer. Behind those walls, she was a queen of degradation. But it wasn't just the parents. Their youngest son, Shah Murphy, a failed priest, transformed the institution into something darker. Shah was a theologian of torment. He understood the power of belief, not to save but to destroy. He would look into a woman's eyes, speak a verse from scripture, and watch her world collapse, not from pain, but from guilt. He made the women doubt themselves, doubt their memories, their bodies, even their names. He didn't use chains, he used words, and his voice could make God feel like the enemy. Within the first year, the institution was already profitable. Not from rehabilitation, from access, from silence, and from the men who paid to keep it that way. Wealthy clients, police commanders, judges, business magnates. They called it a correctional facility. But inside, it was a farm for despair. The women were not treated, they were harvested. Each inmate underwent what they called the intake cleansing. First stripped, then examined, then photographed, catalogued like livestock. Their names replaced by numbers, their histories erased, their bodies marked with codes. Some were selected immediately for private clientele. Others were put to work in what the Murphy family called redemption chambers, textile rooms repurposed into labor dungeons. No clocks, no sunlight, no contact with the outside world. This wasn't an accident. It was design. You see, the Murphy family didn't operate in chaos. They created an ecosystem of horror that was self-sustaining. For every woman broken, there was another on her way. For every death, a legal document to justify it. And for every crime committed within those walls, there was a priest or politician willing to bless it. This was not a secret organization hiding in the shadows. It was hiding in the light. And Manhattan looked the other way, because no one wants to know where the filth goes when it's cleaned off the streets. But you're here, and now you can't unhear this. You've crossed into the place where truth has teeth. And we've only just begun. There's a reason the House of Religious Correction never appeared on official city maps. Not because it was hidden, but because it was protected. The building had an address, but no one could ever remember it. Deliveries arrived at night. Visitors entered through side gates. No press, no oversight. No records beyond what the Murphy family kept in their private ledgers, and even those were encrypted in a code only Shah Murphy could decipher. The real machinery of their terror didn't run on violence, it ran on belief. Every wall of that building was baptized in fear, every corridor designed to erase identity, and every act of abuse was performed under the illusion of salvation. You see, a woman doesn't break when you beat her, she breaks when you convince her that she deserved it, and that's what the Murphys mastered. Shah held what he called midnight confessionals. In a chamber lit only by candlelight, women were forced to confess not only their sins but their thoughts, their dreams, their desires. These sessions were recorded in journals lined with biblical scripture, as if their shame itself was holy writ. Shah would circle dangerous thoughts in red ink, symbols of defiance, and use them to escalate punishment schedules. Patrick, meanwhile, oversaw the labor systems. He believed idleness was the seed of rebellion. Women worked 16 hours a day, textile sorting, embroidery, binding Bibles for export. The irony was cruel and deliberate. Each book they stitched bore messages of hope and redemption, and each one was sold to the same churches that condemned them. Kathleen designed what she called the Mercy Program, a twisted reward system that offered reduced labor or shorter sentences in exchange for betrayal. Women were instructed to report on each other's moral deviations. A glance, a whisper, a moment of hesitation. The accused were taken to isolation chambers. The informants were praised publicly during morning scripture. This program shattered friendships, destroyed trust, and forced loyalty to the Murphys over anyone else. There was no safety in silence, and no escape in obedience. Some women tried to disappear within themselves, shutting down emotionally, speaking only when spoken to, but even that was punished. The family believed passivity was rebellion in disguise, and so the quiet ones were subjected to sensory manipulation. Locked in pitch-black cells, fed erratic meals, exposed to unpredictable noise, bells, screams, sermons played on repeat. Days bled into nights until time ceased to exist. The women didn't know what month it was, what year, whether their families were alive or dead, and soon they stopped wondering. One woman, Mary Callahan, arrived in 1841 after being arrested for loitering with suggestive posture. She was 19, a seamstress, illiterate. Within 2 weeks, her intake number had replaced her name on all documents. Within a month, she stopped speaking. By the second month, she was selected for a client of high moral authority. That man was Reverend Hartford. When she tried to resist, she was made an example of. Shah preached a sermon to the entire facility about the sin of Eve, about women who tempt righteous men into darkness. He described Mary's fall in vivid detail, equating her resistance to spiritual pride. That night, she was shaved bald, shackled, and paraded through the halls with a sign around her neck that read, "Whore of Babylon." The other women were forced to watch in silence. Mary lasted 7 more weeks, then she disappeared from the records. The ledgers noted her as red, beamed through suffering. This wasn't punishment, it was doctrine, and the city kept paying. Because the Murphys didn't just run a prison, they ran a business, a machine that fed on vulnerable women and turned them into capital, spiritual, political, financial, and the gears turned smooth because they were oiled with prayer. That's why you've never heard of this. Because if the truth ever got out, the rot at the root of it all would be too familiar to ignore. And here's the truth they never wanted you to find. The system didn't fail these women. The system was built for this. The corridors were never quiet, even when no footsteps echoed. The walls held memory, faint sobs, ghost-like whispers, the rhythmic creak of beds chained to the floor, all blended into a soundscape of despair. The house of religious correction wasn't a prison in the traditional sense. It was a stage, a theater of suffering designed not just to punish, but to perform. Every scream was a sermon, every silence a confession. The Murphy family didn't just isolate women from the world, they isolated them from themselves, and they did it using the most precise instrument of all, ritual. Every morning began with the ceremony of cleansing. At 4 a.m., bells rang through the building, deep, hollow chimes that triggered a Pavlovian dread. Women lined up in rows, barefoot on freezing stone floors. They were made to chant scripture while scrubbing their own bodies with coarse lye soap under the supervision of Kathleen. Each word missed, each line mumbled, was recorded and punished with reflective isolation, an hour in the black room where a woman was forced to kneel on broken slate and recite her offenses into the dark. The goal wasn't hygiene, it was obedience through pain. After cleansing came labor, but not just industrial labor. The Murphys had diversified. Thomas had struck a deal with private clients, men with reputations too valuable to risk public scandal. Women were assigned to secret chambers where they were instructed to serve. The visitors under the guise of therapeutic confession. These sessions were scheduled, catalogued, and priced according to the victim's spiritual profile. The younger and more devout the woman had been before entry, the higher her value. That was part of the appeal, to break what was once pure, and the city's elite paid generously for the privilege. Every corner of the facility served a function in this unholy economy. The fourth floor, closed to most staff, was known internally as the sanctuary. No guards patrolled it, no windows faced the street. Here, Shah and Kathleen conducted what they referred to as experiments in redemption. Methods imported from Inquisition-era manuals, psychological studies disguised as exorcisms. Women were made to stare at crucifixes for hours, while recordings of their own voices, captured during confession, were played back through hidden devices. This sensory dissonance was designed to fracture the mind, making them question what was real, what was sin, what was self. Some snapped, others submitted, but none came back the same. And that was the point. The institution's brilliance wasn't in how it hid its crimes, but how it made its victims complicit in their own destruction. Kathleen taught women to write letters of gratitude to judges and priests who had sentenced them, thanking them for the chance at spiritual salvation. These letters were published in Reform Society pamphlets as proof of success. But none of those women ever saw freedom again. Once a woman crossed the threshold, she was no longer a person. She became part of the Murphy system. And the system had no exit protocol. Even death was managed. Mary Murphy, with her crude medical tools and her obsession with endurance, oversaw what she called terminal observation. Women whose bodies were failing from malnutrition or disease were not given rest. They were died. She recorded how long it took for the body to collapse without sustenance, how long the mind could survive with only scripture and pain. She documented their final moments as if they were science experiments, not human beings. Then the remains were burned in the basement furnace, disguised as trash incineration from laundry operations. No burials, no records, just ash. This was not some fringe cult hiding in the alleyways. This was a state-supported institution, funded, protected, blessed, because it did exactly what society asked of it, erased women who didn't fit the mold, and gave powerful men a place to indulge their appetites behind a mask of righteousness. If you've made it this far, it's because you sense what most refuse to admit. There is no safety in compliance, only in awareness. Remember this phrase and type it twice in the comments to lock it into your mind. Obedience is the disguise of control. Obedience is the disguise of control. Because from this point forward, what you'll hear will change how you see every institution that claims to protect you. There was a ledger, bound in black leather, hidden behind the altar in Shah Murphy's private quarters. It contained no names, only numbers, intake codes, payment columns, notes written in Latin, Greek, and a shorthand of Shah's own invention. Cross-referenced with scripture, medical notations, and coded ratings of purity and resistance. This book was not a record of sin. It was a catalogue of souls the Murphy family had broken, bought, or buried. You see, the institution did not operate in chaos. It was a machine of metrics, a closed system where suffering was quantified, women were sorted, measured, reassigned based on their psychological pliability. Those who resisted were tested until they cracked. Those who submitted too easily were discarded. The ideal victim, what Shah called the vessel, was one who broke just enough to obey, but retained enough self-awareness to feel shame. Shame was the key. Because shame could be weaponized. Shame is what kept the victims quiet even when the doors opened. It made them blame themselves. It made them believe that maybe, just maybe, they deserved it. This was psychological engineering before psychology had a name. Each member of the Murphy family played a specific role in the process. Patrick enforced, Kathleen conditioned, Shah rewired, Mary monitored, and Thomas ensured no one outside the walls ever saw the truth. But truth has a habit of leaking. In the winter of 1848, a city clerk named Elias Croft began noticing irregularities in prisoner transfer logs. Women sentenced by Judge Prescott to the House of Religious Correction often vanished from all future records. No release dates, no hospitalizations, no deaths, just disappeared. Croft made inquiries, quiet ones. He asked questions in the court archives, spoke to a nurse at Bellevue who'd treated a girl who escaped the house, emaciated, catatonic, and missing fingernails. That nurse was reassigned to Staten Island within 48 hours. Croft received a letter, unsigned, warning him to leave moral reform to those appointed by God. But Croft didn't stop. He compiled a dossier, names, dates, testimonies, and attempted to present it to the city's Committee on Moral Welfare. He never made it to the meeting. His body was found floating in the East River 3 days later. Official cause: accidental drowning after heavy drinking. Unofficially, everyone knew what happened. The Murphy family had friends in every office. The institution was untouchable. But the death of Elias Croft wasn't in vain. His documents, smuggled out by a sympathetic clerk, survived. They were buried, locked in a personal vault at the old Dutch bank and forgotten. Until 1934, when the building was demolished to make way for a new subway line. That's when the vault was discovered. That's when the sealed documents were opened. And that's when the horror became undeniable. Photographs of women bound to rusted medical chairs, handwritten sermon transcripts describing purifications conducted with acid and lye, payment receipts from judges, police captains, even bishops. But by then, it was too late for justice. Everyone involved was either dead, protected, or powerful enough to rewrite the narrative, so they buried the evidence. Again, the press was told the basement was a religious archive. The bones found beneath the floor were dismissed as construction-era animal remains. The ledgers were declared inconclusive and filed under restricted court records. The incident was never reported, until now. Because now you're holding the pieces in your mind, and once you connect them, you'll never see society the same way again. You'll see the faces smiling from behind pulpits and podiums. You'll see the architects of suffering disguised as saviors. And you'll ask a terrifying question: what other institutions were built the same way? Because if a family like the Murphys could run a house of horrors for 30 years, what's hiding in plain sight today? By the early 1850s, the House of Religious Correction had become something far more dangerous than an institution. It had become an idea, a self-replicating myth of righteousness. Judges praised it, clergy defended it, philanthropists donated to it, and men in smoky backrooms smiled as the profits rolled in. But here's the secret no one understood. The real commodity wasn't the women. It was the illusion. The illusion that justice was being served, that sin was being cleansed, that power could be holy. Every building needs a foundation. The Murphy family built theirs on fear, but reinforced it with paperwork, carefully forged release forms, testimonies written by trembling hands under threat of punishment, sanitized reports delivered to city offices boasting of 95% success rates in moral correction. All of it designed to protect the image. Because in a corrupt society, the appearance of virtue is more valuable than virtue itself. Patrick Murphy knew that. He said it often to his sons. Truth doesn't matter if the story's good enough. So they built the perfect story, and no one wanted to tear it down. But inside those walls, the reality was a machine chewing through flesh and spirit. The women weren't inmates. They were inventory, each one with a ledger entry, a profit margin, a shelf life. The youngest, ages 12 to 16, were reserved for silent benefactors. These men never appeared in the official books, but their donations kept the institution running through economic downturns, city audits, even political elections. In return, they received what the Murphys called special visitations, private evenings, no questions, no consequences. The women who survived these visitations often didn't survive long. They were classified as structurally compromised and reassigned to basement quarters where they were used as test subjects for Mary Murphy's experiments. These weren't just surgical tortures. Mary was obsessed with the limits of spiritual endurance. She wanted to know, how many times can a person be forced to pray while bleeding before they lose faith entirely? She had a theory. She tested it for 17 years. Kathleen, meanwhile, refined her psychological conditioning techniques. She began experimenting with linguistic erasure. Women were forbidden to speak their native languages, especially Irish and German. Offenders were beaten, then placed in complete silence for 3 days, allowed to speak only in scripture afterward. This wasn't just punishment, it was cultural deletion. Language, after all, is identity. Strip the words, and you strip the self. Shah Murphy expanded his theological manipulations. He introduced a new ritual, the mirror hour. Women were led into a chamber with a large bronze mirror covered in dust. One by one, they were made to look into it while Shah stood behind them reciting verses about sin, shame, and eternal judgment. The mirror warped and rusted, distorted their reflections, twisting their bodies, aging their faces, turning them into monsters in their own eyes. Some fainted, others clawed at their skin. A few tore out their hair in silence. Shah would mark these reactions in his journal with phrases like self-hatred achieved or identity collapse successful. The point wasn't to punish, it was to remake. To empty the woman and refill her with shame so thick, obedience became her only escape. This wasn't correction, it was alchemy, and it worked. That's why the Murphy facility became a model for similar institutions across the country, most notably in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Clergy would tour the house, guided by Shah himself, and leave with glowing praise. A triumph of Christian order, one called it. A miracle of moral reform, wrote another. What they said was carefully staged. Women cleaned up, choreographed confessions, scripted gratitude. They never saw the real rooms, the real rituals, the real purpose, but they didn't want to. Because power never interrogates what feeds it, it just consumes. So ask yourself, how many institutions today operate on that same principle? How many prisons, schools, churches, and clinics claim to heal while feeding on suffering behind locked doors? How many truths have you been taught to trust just because they were wrapped in ritual? There are doors they don't want you to open. But you're standing in front of one right now, and I'm about to unlock it. There was one room that no one outside the family ever saw. No staff, no guards, not even the city inspectors who occasionally wandered in for the sake of appearances. The Murphys called it the chapel below. It was never mentioned in blueprints, never listed in court documents, but the women knew it existed because the women who went down there never came back the same. Some never came back at all. The chapel below was a sub-basement chamber, deeper than the foundation, accessible only through a trapdoor beneath Shah Murphy's quarters. It had no crosses, no pews, no stained glass, only stone walls, a ring of iron chains, and a raised platform carved with scripture in a language even the priests who visited couldn't recognize. It wasn't Latin. It was older. Shah claimed he found the inscriptions in an ancient monastery text, smuggled out of Europe by a defrocked monk who'd been executed for heresy in 1792. He believed it was the original language of divine judgment, a sacred tongue designed to purge not just sin, but identity itself. That's what the rituals in the chapel were for. Erasure. Total. What took weeks to accomplish upstairs could be done in a single night below. This is where Shah tested his most radical theories, blending theology, trauma, and sensory overload. Women were stripped of all clothing, smeared with ash, and forced to recite psalms while being spun slowly in circles. A small, rotating iron brazier in the center of the room emitted fumes from burning roots and herbs, Mary's special mixtures designed to induce hallucinations and spiritual terror. The goal wasn't just confession, it was surrender. And it worked. One survivor, Abigail Moore managed to escape in 1854 after 6 months inside. When found wandering near the Hudson, barefoot and bleeding, she spoke in fractured phrases, switching between English, Biblical Hebrew, and the Strang, a language from the chapel. She had been a teacher before her arrest, literate, articulate, strong-willed. Now she wept at the sight of daylight. When asked what had happened to her, she replied with one sentence over and over again: "He made God into fire." She was committed to Blackwell's asylum the next day. Her testimony sealed, her name scrubbed from records, but not before a sympathetic nurse smuggled out a page she had written, filled with sigils, diagrams, and one repeated phrase written backwards: "We were meant to burn." These weren't isolated acts of madness, they were pieces of a grander design. The Murphy family believed that suffering purged corruption, but not to save the soul, to reshape it, to turn women into conduits for control. Their philosophy was simple: break a mind so completely that it no longer resists the world, and it will serve that world without question. Sound familiar? Look around. The system doesn't want warriors, it wants worshippers. Not of truth, but of order. Obedience is currency, silence is virtue, and suffering is the sacrament. That's why institutions like this thrive, because they train people to see their own destruction as moral growth. They convince you that your pain is your fault, that your punishment is your path to goodness. They rewire you, and you never even see it happening. That's what made the Murphy family powerful. They didn't just create victims, they created believers. Women who came out thanking their abusers, writing letters praising their captors, testifying in court, scripted and conditioned, that they had been saved, and the city applauded. Because when the oppressed praise the oppressor, the system feels righteous, even holy. But beneath all of it was that room, that chapel, that place where the soul was turned inside out and remade into something useful to men like Judd. The fire started in silence. No bells, no cries, just a slow curling of smoke rising from the eastern wing of the House of Religious Correction. It was October the 3rd, 1856, 3 days after a mysterious visitor from Europe arrived and was escorted by Thomas Murphy through the hidden West Corridor. Official records claim it was a coal stove malfunction, but the survivors tell a different story. They say it was a ritual gone wrong, or maybe gone right. Let's go back. That night, 12 women were selected for what Shah Murphy called the Red Vigil. It was whispered about in hushed voices for years, even among staff. No one knew what it truly meant, only that those selected never returned. Not upstairs, not in coffins, not even as ash. They were erased. The Red Vigil was never mentioned in sermons or journals, but one page, torn and hidden in the lining of a servant's cloak, offers a clue. It was a drawing, crudely etched in blood and charcoal. 12 bodies, arranged in a star. One central figure standing over them, arms wide, head aflame, and beneath it, 2 words, Flamma Animae, the flame of the soul. What happened that night in the chapel below wasn't just torture, it was invocation. Shah believed he had refined the process, that with the right combination of pain, prayer, and purification, a spiritual threshold could be crossed. That a human mind, properly shattered, could become a vessel not just for obedience, but for revelation. He wanted to speak to what came before the scriptures, and on that night he succeeded. At least that's what the survivors say. Because the fire didn't spread normally, it didn't crawl, it erupted. Stone melted, iron chains fused to the floor. The walls of the chapel below cracked in symmetrical patterns, as if something inside had tried to push outward. 12 bodies were never found, but 13 shadows were burned in to the walls. And in the ashes of the sanctuary, a single sentence was scorched into the ceiling beams, upside down, carved with fingernails deep into the wood. "We are still here." The city moved quickly to cover it. Judge Prescott issued a statement claiming faulty heating. The press praised the quick response of firefighters. Donations poured in to rebuild, and quietly a new facility was opened across the river under a different name. The Haven for Female Redemption. Same family, same rituals, new facade. The Murphys had learned something from the fire. Not that the ritual was wrong, but that it worked too well. From that point on, the chapel below was sealed, not with bricks, with prayers. Shah wrote new scripture, his own gospel, a book of shadows disguised as a psalm book, locked in an iron case beneath the altar of the new haven. Only he and Mary knew the full contents. The rest of the family followed. They understood now. This wasn't just about control. It was about contact. They weren't just reshaping women. They were opening something, tearing a seam between this world and something else. And while they would no longer risk invoking it directly, they learned to draw power from the residue, from the fear, from the shame, from the surrendered minds. Each soul broken in that institution didn't just fuel the family's grip on society. It fed the thing Shah believed still waited beneath the chapel. Some called it the voice, others the flame. But those who heard it were never the same. Their eyes changed, their speech became erratic, and their loyalty to the Murphy family became absolute. So ask yourself, how many of our leaders today have been through institutions like these? How many were broken and rebuilt not for healing but for programming? You look at a man in power and wonder why he smiles as others suffer. You think, how can he be so empty? What if the real question is, what filled him after he was emptied? The house may be gone, but the ritual isn't. The folding school was never supposed to exist. On paper, it didn't. There was no official purchase of land, no ribbon cutting, no city funding, and no surviving architectural plans. What we know comes from stolen letters, missing ledger entries, and one hand-drawn map found stuffed into a priest's coat pocket after he vanished in 1861. But the structure was real. Buried deep in the northern reaches of Manhattan, where the city's grip loosened and silence could be bought with fear, the folding school was built as a transitional site, a place for the most failed cases of the House of Religious Correction, girls too broken to return to society and yet too valuable to discard. That word, folding, was no accident. The Murphys believed in breaking women, yes, but some breaks were too deep, too complete. In those cases, they needed to be reshaped. Bent inward, folded into something new, something useful. Shah Murphy oversaw its creation, but Kathleen ran it. She called it her quiet sanctuary. And silence was its first rule. No speaking, no singing, no prayers, only gestures, only signals. Because Kathleen believed language was a virus, that once a woman had been shattered, every word she spoke was infected with trauma. The only cure? Silence. She imposed it with a brutal system. The tongue collar. A thin strip of iron fastened behind the teeth and bolted to the molars, designed to prevent speech while allowing breath. Girls wore them for weeks, some for years. The damage was irreversible, speech patterns changed, jawbones weakened, but that was the point. Kathleen wasn't interested in healing. She wanted obedience without identity, memory without voice. These girls weren't prisoners. They were echoes, each one assigned to a station, cleaning, preparing food, cataloging notes from the house, but they weren't allowed to write their own names. Only symbol. A triangle, a broken sun, a hand with no fingers. Each symbol meant something to Kathleen. To her, they weren't girls anymore. They were instruments. And then came the folding room. It was a small chamber at the center of the school, octagonal, windowless, padded with lambskin and layered in cloth embroidered with biblical verses written backwards. In the center, a single chair, wooden, curved, no legs, just a hollow bowl designed to hold the body in a fetal position. Girls were placed inside and spun slowly in complete darkness, while a low hum played from a pipe organ mounted in the wall. The notes weren't random, they were tuned to frequencies believed to induce disassociation. Kathleen called it the sacred inversion. Many of the girls emerged mute, others forgot their names. One was found whispering over and over again, "My skin is someone else's now." Once a girl had passed the folding process, she was given a choice. serve as a monitor, or become a vessel. Monitors wore blue robes and enforced silence. Vessels wore white and were sent back to the city, but not to live, to infiltrate, to marry, to influence. These women were trained not just to obey, but to manipulate. Their trauma made them hollow, and into that hollowness the Murphys poured ideology, scripture, and psychological triggers. They became perfect tools, appearing refined, pious, and submissive, but hiding the cold logic of indoctrinated agents. Some married judges, others became nuns. One infiltrated the mayor's family, and none were ever traced back to the folding school because no one even knew it existed. But it did. And in 1865, it vanished, burned to the ground in a fire with no visible origin. Only a single monitor survived. She wandered into a chapel near Greenwich, bloodied, with pages of the Murphy psalm book stitched into her dress. Witnesses say she knelt, wept, and muttered just 3 words. The folding failed. But did it? Because if you look at the women of influence in post-war New York, if you look at the sudden rise of female-led charitable organizations, spiritual retreats, and correctional leagues, many of them trace back to unknown origins. Women with no past, no family, no accent, only one trait in common. They never spoke of pain because they were taught it was holy. You want to know how this spreads? This is how. Not through armies, but through silence. Through women who have been folded so tightly, they no longer bend, they bind. And what they're binding is your freedom. Her name was Mercy O'Malley, and she was supposed to be the crown jewel of the Murphy system. She had every trait they sought: orphaned young, quiet, devout, a natural at mimicking obedience. She was transferred to the House of Religious Correction at age 13, passed through the chapel below by 15, and entered the folding school before her 16th birthday. But there was something they didn't see. Mercy wasn't broken. She was waiting for them to let their guard down, waiting for them to think they'd won. And then she turned. No one knows exactly when it started, but there are clues. Small anomalies in the carefully maintained Murphy archives. A patient file switched with another, a symbolic mark scribbled upside down, tiny details that don't match the rigid order of the system. In one confiscated journal entry, Kathleen Murphy wrote, "Subject M93 exhibits mirroring, perfect compliance, but I sensed dissonance behind her eyes, a tremor in the obedience." Dissonance. That was Mercy's weapon. She gave them everything they wanted: perfect posture, unwavering silence, pious smiles, and used their system to study them. She memorized the structure of the folding school. She learned how the monitors communicated. She even pretended to hallucinate during the inversion sessions, scribbling false visions on the walls to throw off suspicion. But she remembered everything. She was playing a long game. By 17, she had been elevated to vessel status and was sent to live with the family of Reverend James Carrick, one of the Murphy loyalists. He was a man of enormous influence, politically connected, financially entwined with the Murphy real estate network, and known for funding homes for fallen girls. Mercy married his son within a year. By the time she was 19, she was inside their home, inside their church, inside their mind. So that's when she began to unravel the machine. She started by planting doubt, asking innocent questions at the Sunday table about the true purpose of the house, slipping copies of the corrupted scripture into the church archives, whispering to other wives late at night that she'd heard things, that not all girls who entered the house came out whole, that some never came out at all. And it worked. Slowly, the cracks began to show. One of the Reverend's daughters-in-law fled in the night and testified anonymously to a reporter. Another began suffering panic attacks after discovering a sewn-shut book in her husband's closet, a psalm book written in mirror text. But Mercy wasn't just exposing the truth. She was sabotaging the ritual itself. She knew from her time in the chapel and the folding room that the Murphy system depended on belief. The flame they worshipped, whatever force Shah had contacted, fed on obedience, submission, and fear. But it could be starved. If the broken stopped believing, if the silence was broken, if one voice, just one, refused to bow, the structure would begin to collapse. And that's exactly what happened. In 1868, a letter was found nailed to the doors of Trinity Church. Written in blood-red ink, it read, "You taught me to suffer. I thank you, because now I understand your language, and I will speak it back to you in fire. M." A week later, the Carrick estate burned to the ground. Mercy vanished. The Murphys called it rebellion. The papers called it hysteria. But the truth, it was a counter-ritual. Mercy had learned the code of the flame, and she turned it on its creators. She inverted the symbols. She rewrote the prayers. She didn't reject the trauma. They had tried that on her. She wielded it like a blade. No one ever found her body, but her letters kept surfacing, tucked into Bibles, etched into asylum walls. Whiston paired in confessions. "I did not escape the chapel. I brought it with me. And now I am its fire." Mercy O'Malley didn't just survive. She infected the system with doubt. And from that moment on, the Murphy dynasty began to fracture from within. Because when the folded unfold, they don't return to what they were. They become something worse. Something the architects of pain can't control. Her name was Mary Murphy, the eldest daughter of Shah. But inside the family, they didn't call her Mary. They called her the Thorn. Because unlike her siblings, Mary wasn't interested in ceremony. She didn't worship the flame or weep over scripture. She wasn't fascinated by ritual. She was fascinated by results. If Shah was the prophet, Mary was the executor. Where others whispered, Mary commanded. Where others prayed, Mary planned. And when the house burned, when the folding school collapsed, when Mercy O'Malley vanished into myth, Mary didn't flinch. She smiled, because she had already prepared for collapse. She didn't need institutions. She needed influence. She didn't care about converting souls. She wanted to own minds. Her vision wasn't spiritual. It was structural, permanent. And in the vacuum left by the fall of the Murphy network, Mary moved like a chess master, rebuilding not cathedrals, but councils. And the first council she formed? The Society for Civic Morality. It sounded harmless, a woman-led organization for promoting virtue in post-war New York. Its slogan was plastered on leaflets handed out in churches and schools: truth, temperance, transformation. But beneath the leaflets were forged ledgers, bribed judges, and a shadow network of correctional inspectors trained in psychological domination. Graduates not from schools, but from Mary's hidden facility beneath the ruins of the old house. She called it the Veil. Unlike the chapel below, the Veil wasn't built for prayer. It was built for retraining. Girls weren't punished here. They were reshaped, psychologically inverted using a combination of sensory deprivation, symbolic rewriting, and controlled exposure to fear stimuli. Each girl was placed in what Mary called the mirror loop, a mental protocol designed to erase her previous sense of self and reassign her identity as a moral executor. They weren't taught to obey, they were taught to enforce, to become predators in pious skin. And then, they were released. Not as wives, not as nuns, but as inspectors, reformers, board members, and directors of women's shelters, juvenile homes, temperance leagues, and parish councils. They moved through the city like ghosts with smiles, advocating for moral uplift, while secretly flagging dissidents, recruiting the vulnerable, and forwarding names to the Veil for quiet extraction. And Mary kept all of it hidden behind charity. The society's financials were spotless. Their public face was angelic. They even launched a campaign to aid orphans of the fire, using Mercy O'Malley's story as a twisted symbol of redemption. In pamphlets, she was repackaged as a misguided girl who had returned to the church before death, a cautionary tale rewritten as victory. But some of us knew the truth. One investigator, Father Dylan Lang, tried to expose it. He found inconsistencies in the records, visited the ruins of the house, and even stole a redacted entry from a Murphy ledger. The entry was dated 1869. It listed one name, M. O'Malley, reclaimed. 2 weeks later, Father Lang was found dead in his study, eyes gouged, lips sewn, a single phrase carved into the inside of his thigh: "The Thorn remembers." Because Mary never forgot. She didn't just want to rebuild the family's power, she wanted revenge, not just on mercy, on doubt itself. Mary saw what the fire had done, how one girl's resistance infected the system like a virus, so she created protocols for pre-doubt conditioning, techniques to inoculate girls before they questioned, before they rebelled. They were taught that pain was logic, that fear was instruction, that doubt was violence against the soul. And slowly, the Veil's methods began leaking into public institutions. Schools change, but their discipline methods. Asylums adopted new psychological doctrines. Even the city's orphanages began using moral language eerily similar to Mary's Psalms. The flame was no longer worshipped, it was embedded. And Mary didn't need to light fires anymore. She became one, and she burned quietly. The Veil wasn't a prison. It was an algorithm made of pain. Buried beneath the old Murphy estate, where the house once stood in splinters and ash, Mary Murphy erected something far more dangerous than a chapel or school, a system, a laboratory for soul inversion, not with fire, not with chains, with symbols, sequences, silence. This was where she tested her final theory. If the soul cannot be owned, then it must be rewritten. The entrance was hidden beneath a crypt in St. Ludlow's cemetery. Beneath a stone marked "Saints Weep Softly," the ground descended into darkness. No one without the code could enter, but if you did, you'd find no screams, only the sound of dripping ink. The ink rooms were the first stop for any girl brought to the Veil. Here, rows of women sat in silence, copying pages of rewritten scripture. Not in English, not in Latin, but in inversion glyph, a symbolic language Mary created by reversing, rotating, and corrupting old Catholic texts. Each glyph was paired with a color and a sound tone. Over time, these combinations acted like psychic triggers, breaking the linear patterns of thought and dissolving language into obedience. After 2 weeks in the ink rooms, the girls no longer remembered what they were writing. They only remembered how it felt. Then came the masking stage. Each initiate was fitted with a facial screen, the Thorn Veil, a porcelain mask lined with obsidian threads that delivered soft electrical pulses. These pulses were triggered anytime the girl displayed certain behaviors: hesitation, empathy, personal pronouns. It wasn't punishment. It was correction. She was taught to erase the I, not just from speech, but from memory. Over time, the subjects began referring to themselves in the third person, then not at all. Some wrote messages like, "The vessel is empty. The mirror speaks. Mary knows." Because she was there, every day. Mary didn't rule from afar. She watched each ritual, studied each subject. She kept journals of their eye movements, muscle twitches, and heartbeat patterns during stress exposure. She wasn't a prophet, she was a neurosurgeon of the soul. And then came the final inversion, the mirror baptism. It took place in a chamber lined with mirrored glass, each panel distorted to warp the girl's reflection. In the center, a pool of ink, not water, thick, black, cold. The subject was lowered into the pool backward while reciting the reversed psalms in inversion glyph, with a Murphy monitor whispering instructions in her ear. If she resurfaced and responded to her new name, a name chosen from the Murphy Book of Saints, she was deemed rewritten. If not, she was sent to the binding room. No one returned from there. We only have fragments of what went on inside: a torn journal, a coded confession, one sentence scratched into stone near the chamber door. "She poured fire into my mouth and told me it was grace." By 1870, the Veil had processed over 430 women. 87 were placed into society, 31 joined reformist organizations, 12 became heads of asylums or moral councils, and at least 5 infiltrated the press. That's how Mary covered her tracks. Every time someone got too close, an editor, an investigator, a bishop, an article would surface painting them as deranged or morally compromised or linked to Mercy O'Malley. And if that didn't work, they disappeared. Mary didn't need to control the world, she only needed to control who told its story. She understood something even Shah hadn't grasped. Pain is powerful, ritual is deep, but narrative is eternal, and so she built an army of narrators. Women who smiled sweetly and whispered poison into systems designed to save. Women who didn't know they'd been rewritten, only that their past was fog, their purpose was clarity, and their loyalty was to one name. Murphy. But Mary's control wasn't perfect. There were anomalies, cracks. In 1870, a Vale subject escaped during a flood. She was found wandering in Yonkers, face scarred from removing her mask, whispering a name over and over. Not her own. Mercy, mercy, mercy. Because the ghost hadn't died. It had returned. They were two sides of the same mirror. Mercy O'Malley, the girl who survived the flame, only to carry it back into the world like a weapon. Mary Murphy, the architect of pain who believed rewriting the soul was not cruelty but perfection. And in the summer of 1870, their paths collided. It started with a whisper. A former Vale subject known only as Subject L49 was discovered unconscious in the gutter outside a tenement in 5 Points, branded with Murphy glyphs across her spine, face fractured where her mask had been torn off. But that's not what sent panic through the inner circles. It was the note clutched in her hand, a scrap of parchment soaked in blood and ash, scrawled with a message. You inverted the soul. I inverted the ritual. We are not your mirrors anymore. Mary read the note, and for the first time in decades, she panicked. She issued Protocol Blackthorn, a full lockdown of all Vale outposts. Monitors were recalled, subjects re-evaluated, and the original chamber of ink was set aflame. But it was too late. Mercy had already rewritten the code. She'd spent years studying the Vale from the outside, deciphering the glyph language, tracing the signs embedded in public sermons and moral education pamphlets. She found patterns, rotations, mathematical rhythms in the way Murphy's doctrine was taught. She realized something critical. The glyphs could be reversed again, not back to Latin, not back to scripture, but to truth. With the help of a disillusioned former monitor codenamed Brother Els, Mercy created the first known unfolding sequence, a set of spoken phrases, symbols, and visual triggers that collapsed the inversion loop. She tested it on a rescued girl. It worked, and then she sent it into the world. Hidden in music, sewn into prayer beads, etched into the margin of Bibles and asylum logbooks. Mercy turned Mary's own son, Istem, against her, and the collapse began. By August, 3 council mothers had vanished. 7 Vale subjects had committed mass defection, each one leaving behind inverted drawings of the Thorn Veil, masks shattered, turned inside out. Mary responded with purges. She eliminated all external cells. She summoned her most loyal inverted, 12 women known as the Silence, and retreated into the Deep Room, the final chamber beneath the veil, where her earliest journals and Shah's last surviving relics were kept. There, she began her final ritual. Not of rewriting, of erasure. She planned to burn the glyphs, the relics, the names, everything. If she couldn't control the narrative, she would destroy it. But she wasn't alone. That same night, a fire erupted on the southern edge of the Murphy estate ruins. Local police responded to the flames, but when they arrived, there was no building, only scorched earth, and in the center, 2 women, one cloaked in black, face pale, voice silent. The other, barefoot, scarred, holding a page of inverted scripture soaked in blood. They didn't speak, they just walked toward each other. And somewhere in that field of ash, they disappeared. Some say Mary killed Mercy. Others say Mercy burned Mary's name from history. But a third story exists, found in a coded letter mailed to a forgotten parish in Harlem. 2 women entered the mirror, one shattered, one reflected. Neither returned whole. After that night, the veil was never seen again. Its chambers sealed, its subjects vanished. The Murphy name faded from public power, replaced by newer institutions, cleaner names, softer masks. But for those who knew how to look, the signs remained. A symbol carved into a church pew, a phrase in a school's motto, a face in the background of an old orphanage photo. And if you followed those signs, they led to one door, unmarked, high, dead cold, and carved into its surface, barely visible. The mirror never forgot. The fire may have gone out, but the language remained. After the disappearance of Mary Murphy and Mercy O'Malley, the ruins of the Vale were abandoned. Officially, the land was condemned, but in truth, it was purchased, quietly, through shell companies, passed from trust to trust, until no one could trace the real owner. But someone kept the records, someone kept the glyphs, and in the decades that followed, they didn't fade, they mutated. Because what Mary created wasn't just a cult ritual, it wasn't theology. It was a system of behavioral reconditioning built on linguistic collapse, symbol repetition, and identity dissociation. It was programmable. And in 1874, just 4 years after the Veil went dark, fragments of its protocols began showing up in places they shouldn't have. The first, the New York Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island. A new ward was opened there, Ward C. It claimed to be testing modern moral correction techniques based on symbol-based therapy. The doctors wore gloves. The patients were forbidden mirrors. And instead of sedation, they used image loops, fractal patterns drawn from glyph scrolls Mary had designed. Within 6 months, 5 patients forgot their names. Within 1 year, 4 died smiling. When questioned by a Reform journalist, one doctor simply replied, "We are purifying doubt." That phrase didn't exist in medicine, but it did exist in one place. Page 73 of Mary Murphy's Unfolding Protocols. By 1878, similar patterns were reported in women's reform schools across Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, institutions that suddenly shifted from corporal punishment to mirrored moral inversion drills. Girls were told to wear identical uniforms, speak only in passive voice, and refer to themselves by a number. The system was efficient. It broke resistance in weeks. By 1881, private sanitariums for the wealthy were quietly licensing what they called mirror phase remediation, a form of talk therapy where the patient repeated symbolic phrases while being denied access to their own reflection. Many of the terms used in this new science were borrowed from glyph studies. Words like anchor loop, verbal veiling, self-concept excision. Doctors claimed these terms were new discoveries, but those who had seen Mary's notes knew the truth. They were plagiarized from the Veil. Mercy saw it too. She tried to stop it. Before her final disappearance, she'd built a small underground network, the Order of the Unfolded, comprised of former glyph subjects who had escaped. Their mission wasn't revenge, it was containment. They began planting counterglyphs inside psychiatric literature, coded notes, drawings, even diagrams laced with reverse inversion sequences. In 1882, a copy of The Journal of Modern Psychology contained a diagram titled Neural Symmetry Through Reflection. The image looked like a spiral, but when reversed and flipped horizontally, it spelled one word, wrong. But the flood had already begun. By the 1890s, the rewritten Murphy methods were everywhere, disguised as progress. Academic psychology began speaking of ego fragmentation and controlled personality suppression. Techniques originally meant to dominate became treatment, and no one traced it back to the girl who burned, because Mary's legacy didn't survive in stories, it survived in systems, and those systems didn't carry her name, but they carried her fingerprints, the masks without straps. The rituals disguised as therapy, the obsession with control over doubt. Even Freud once remarked in a letter to a colleague, "There is a form of hysteria that resists every model unless inverted. These minds speak through riddles of fire and silence." He didn't know it, but he was describing a Murphy inversion subgene. And today, we still use fragments of her system. Anytime a therapy forces identity surrender, anytime a school replaces questions with compliance, you thought it ended in ash. But in war, fire is just the beginning. As the 20th century erupted in steel, smoke, and global bloodshed, nations raced to develop not just weapons, but obedience. Armies could be trained, but loyalty, that required something deeper. It required inversion. And that's when the glyphs reappeared, not in Latin, not in scripture, but in military psychology manuals. By 1916, British intelligence had begun experimenting with what they called morale fracture therapy. They claimed it could break fear, eliminate personal hesitation, and produce clean decision-making units, soldiers without trauma, without guilt. But the source of this new doctrine was strange. One manual, recovered in 1987 from declassified archives, referenced a ritual ink protocol, Series MM. It contained diagrams that were near identical to glyphs found in the Murphy scrolls, spirals with punctured centers, mirrored numbers, and command phrases like, "Refuse the I, become the I." Sound familiar? It should. Mary Murphy had used that exact phrase in the final masking stage of The Veil, the idea that vision, not identity, should become the soldier's compass, observation over emotion, obedience over intuition. And it didn't stop there. 35. Germany. An obscure psychiatric journal titled Geist und Spiegelung, Spirit and Reflection, published a study on what they called symbolische Reintegration, symbolic reintegration. It described a process in which individuals were shown fractured mirror images of themselves while repeating mantra-like phrases in reversed syntax. The phrases weren't German, they were Murphy glyph derivatives. And in the footnotes, a chilling citation, translated from American source, author unknown, archive ref, MM, V theta, Blackthorn. Blackthorn was Mary's final purge protocol. V theta was her glyph for silent dominance. Someone had translated her work and fed it to Europe, and by World War II, it went global. Enter General Frederick Lydon, U.S. Army Psychological Operations Division, decorated, brilliant, secretive, but buried in the margins of his field reports were strange notations, spirals, triangles, and patterns that matched Veil-era glyphs. Lydon believed psychological warfare wasn't just about deception, it was about reconstruction. In 1943, he launched Project Harrow, a covert experiment on U.S. soldiers suffering from battlefield trauma. Instead of standard treatment, subjects were placed in soundproof rooms and exposed to looped glyph patterns combined with whispered commands. Over time, subjects reported dissociative episodes, loss of personal memory, and a new sense of clarity. They began referring to themselves in code names. They responded to command triggers. And one soldier, when asked about his experience, simply said, "She gave me new eyes, she." Even after death, they spoke of Mary as if she still watched them. The experiment was shut down, publicly. Privately, it was transferred to another agency. In 1952, the CIA launches MK Ultra. Most people know the surface story: drugs, hypnosis, psychological torture. But buried deep in Sub-Project 48 was something else. A document titled The Mirror Doctrine, Behavioral Inversion Through Symbol and Sound. The author, uncredited, but the glyphs, pure Murphy, looped sentences. Subject denied self-name for 72 hours. Mirror introduced on day 4. Result, split identification. Breakthrough occurred after subject repeated glyph phrase 17 times. The fire does not burn if you become it. This wasn't just mind control, it was a resurrection. Murphy's system, reborn through war, stitched into the spine of modern intelligence agencies disguised as research, exported globally. By the 1960s, glyph sequences had shown up in Soviet black site programs, British interrogation units, and even private corporate think tanks developing resilience training. But no one called it the Veil. No one said her name. Because Mary didn't care about credit, she cared about influence. And if she could rewrite one woman into silence, she could rewrite a soldier into a weapon, a society into a mirror, a world into obedience. And so she did. There are whispers that some languages don't just speak to the mind, they reprogram it. And by the time the Cold War heated the airwaves with fear, someone remembered Mary Murphy's greatest insight: you do not need to control the body. if you control the frame. In other words, don't force the subject to obey, reshape what they see. And what better tool than television? It began on a quiet Friday evening in 1961 in the Midwest. A small local station, WMTK Channel 7 in Iowa, ran a last-minute programming change. Instead of the usual family-friendly sitcom, they aired a 17-minute short film titled Reflections. No credits, no actors, just a sequence of slow-moving visuals. A child holding a mask. A burning book opened to a mirror. A spiral drawn over a woman's face, and a phrase whispered in reverse. "What you are is not what you were. Look, again." After the broadcast, nothing was reported. No scandal, no headlines, just calls. Hundreds. Viewers complained of migraines, nosebleeds, nightmares. One mother said her daughter wouldn't stop whispering to herself in the mirror. The FCC investigated, but found no anomalies, except for one line buried in a report. Frequency spike at 7.7 Hz during final 90 seconds, source unknown, possible subliminal pattern embedded. The phrase subliminal pattern was new at the time, but it wasn't new to the Veil. Mary had called them echo frames, inverted sequences that bypassed conscious language processing. Her early experiments used them on illiterate orphans. It didn't matter if you understood the glyphs. If you saw them long enough, they wrote themselves into your mind. And now, they were broadcast. By 1964, reports surfaced of similar anomalies. A commercial in Detroit with a backward-spinning eye. A children's cartoon in Boston where shadows moved independent of the characters. A Los Angeles public ACCS program with an opening jingle that, when reversed, contained an eerie chant: "Name forgotten, shape retained, mirror remains." Analysts in private intelligence firms, former MK Ultra contractors, began connecting the dots. Behind closed doors, they called it Project Looking Glass. They believed remnants of Murphy's glyph code had been adapted, not just for torture or therapy, but for mass suggestion. A system of emotional inversion delivered through color, rhythm, pattern, and silence. One memo from a classified psychological warfare unit stated, Murphy's laws were spiritual, her daughters were social, but the glyphs, they are pure architecture. Architecture of what? Perception. Think about it. Television as a reflection, the screen as a mirror, the viewer inverted, sitting still, eyes wide, mouth closed, receiving, like a veil subject, mask off, awaiting programming. But the most chilling discovery came in 1969. A whistleblower from a major media network smuggled out a glyph sequence pulled from a children's broadcast programming packet. It had been listed as a non-linear attention loop, but to a former Veil translator, it was an identity erasure glyph. The translation? The fire returns to those who stare. That broadcast aired to over 2.3 million children. Most forgot it, but some didn't. By the 1970s, fringe mental health professionals reported a strange new symptom. Children drawing spirals, masks, and doors with the word she written beside them. They didn't know who she was, but we do. Because Mary never needed to survive physically, she just needed the glyphs to reach the mirror. And once they did, all it took was a screen. They were born blinking, but not crying. Their mothers had been exposed to glyphs in silence, television, therapy, private schools wrapped in false security. And somewhere in their second trimester, a pattern took root. Not genetic, not divine, but symbolic. These children, born between 1972 and 1985, showed no immediate signs of trauma, no deformities, no physical scars, but from an early age they displayed something far stranger, a refusal to name themselves. By age 3, they would not answer to their given names. By age 5, many had created their own titles in symbols, drawings, or numbers. And by age 7, some began repeating phrases that had never been spoken to them aloud. One boy in Vermont, raised in a remote cabin with no electricity, drew a spiral on his bedroom wall and whispered, the name was taken to protect the mirror. His parents had no idea what it meant, but Mercy O'Malley did. because shortly before her final disappearance in 1887, she warned of something she called the Echo Generation, a class of children born not from blood, but from exposure, carriers of glyph residue, minds open before birth. She wrote, "If the mother stares long enough, the child does not learn language. The child becomes it." Psychologists didn't believe this, but they couldn't explain what came next. Across the US, in select pockets, Denver, Pittsburgh, Sacramento, public schools quietly documented cases of identity transience. Students who switched personas mid-year, who changed handwriting weekly, who sometimes spoke backwards or wrote in glyph-like codes without knowing why. In 1979, a teacher in Baltimore submitted a full journal to the Department of Education detailing the behavior of one girl, age 8, who claimed, "My mother was taught to forget. I was taught to remember. She would draw a closed eye with fire beneath it. She spoke of Leia. She said her real name was Room 4, and when shown her reflection she would sob uncontrollably, then laugh. This wasn't schizophrenia, it wasn't play. It was Program Echo, the unintentional imprint of Mary's glyph sequences, transmitted in utero, then activated through images, light, or repeated phrases. The intelligence community knew. They started calling them Null Children, not because they were nothing, but because they were clean slates, identities unanchored, capable of absorbing new instruction without resistance. In 1983, a secretive branch of military intelligence known as Pilot Mirror recruited a test group of these children, 23 subjects, all from glyph-affected mothers. They were placed into high-structure environments, taught in simulated classrooms using mirror glyphs, and trained to respond to non-verbal commands. By month 6, 18 of them responded to silent directives. By year 1, 7 of them refused to speak altogether, unless spoken to in glyph fragments. One subject, Beta 11, was shown a photo of Mary Murphy. No name, no context. The child touched the image and said, "She is the fire I remember." They shut the program down the next week. Publicly, the children were returned to their families. Privately, most disappeared. Folded into black site facilities, observed, analyzed, forgotten by the world, but not by each other. In 1992, an underground tape circulated among conspiracy archivists. Grainy footage, low res, no source. It shows 7 young adults seated in a circle, each wearing blank masks. One by one, they recite inverted sentences, perfectly synchronized despite being in separate locations. The last one looks directly into the camera and says, "We were not erased, we were stored." And on the screen, as the tape ends, appears one single symbol, a spiral, fractured at the center. The final glyph of the veil. It was known only to Mercy, and it meant return. Because some systems don't die, they wait. They disappeared from the headlines, but not from the system. By the late 1990s, the Null Children, now in their 20s, were no longer monitored. At least not officially. Some re-emerged with new names, clean records, and spotless digital profiles. No known family, no academic history, just job applications with elite cognitive scores and resumes that always seemed to impress the right gatekeepers. They didn't infiltrate through force, they were invited in. And the first place they appeared, tech firms. In 1998, a data analytics startup in Palo Alto quietly hired a behavioral specialist named Marion Vale. No credentials, no formal education, but within a year she had designed a recommendation algorithm so precise it predicted user input 3 interactions ahead. She called it the Looking Glass Engine. Its core principle? People don't seek what they want, they seek what reflects them. That phrase was lifted verbatim from the Veil Doctrine. But no one noticed. Or if they did, they didn't care, because the results were unprecedented. Click-through rates exploded. User retention tripled. And suddenly, every tech company wanted their own mirror layer. They called it personalization. But underneath, it was glyph logic, the recursive feedback principle Mary Murphy perfected in 1841. a loop that reflects what the subject already is, reinforcing identity through image until suggestion becomes indistinguishable from desire. Now imagine that, at scale. By 2005, the Looking Glass engine had been replicated, refactored, and embedded into nearly every major platform. Social media, e-commerce, video streaming, all promising to show you more of what you love. But what if love was never yours to define? A leaked 2011 research memo from a major social media company contained this phrase: a user who mirrors their feed becomes 72% more influence receptive. Optimal exposure time, 66 minutes. Influence receptive was corporate code for programmable, and the test audience, adolescents. Because younger users were more susceptible to mirror saturation, more likely to absorb repeated glyph patterns buried in design choices, infinite scroll, endless spiral, looping content, identity stasis, feedback-driven engagement, externalized self-worth. All of it matched Mary's original veil patterns. Not religious, not moral, architectural. Even the glyphs had evolved. They no longer looked ancient. Now they were disguised as user interface elements, pulsing circles, delayed mirrors, loading spirals, animated masks, symbols that trained the eye to wait, to watch, to want. And the designers behind these systems? Some had no idea what they were building, but a very few, knew exactly what they were doing, because they were trained to. In 2017, a whistleblower from a military-contracted behavioral lab revealed that a pattern recognition division had been tasked with embedding veil-based symbol logic into non-lethal influence systems. That meant school curriculums using reflected learning cycles, voting platforms designed with glyph-coded interface layouts, mental health apps that mirrored user trauma back in looped affirmations. All of it built to condition perception, not just to serve you, but to reshape you. And in the deepest corridors of these systems, somewhere in the code, researchers found a tag, MMRTN04. It stood for Mary Murphy, Return, Glyph, Set 4. Why was it there? No one could explain, or maybe they wouldn't. Because here's the question: if Mary Murphy's glyphs made it into mass media, if her logic now guides how we see ourselves, then who are we really? And more importantly, who built the mirror? It was never called a prison. The official term was Cognitive Redirection Center. But behind its sterile glass facade and philanthropic slogans, healing through insight, the Avalon Institute for Reformation was something far older than it appeared. Founded in 2003 in upstate New York, Avalon claimed to pioneer a new form of inmate rehabilitation. Its creators said it wasn't about punishment, it was about identity reconfiguration. What no one asked was, whose idea of identity? The Institute's lead architect was a man named Dr. Simeon Firth. On paper, he was a cognitive behavioral psychologist with ties to Stanford, but a deeper dig revealed connections to defense subcontracts and a stint at an unmarked facility once listed as part of Project Pilot Mirror, the same black site that had studied the Null Children. And what did Firth bring to Avalon? A protocol he called mirror dosing. Inmates weren't put in cells. They were placed in reflection rooms, circular chambers with no angles, no shadows, and a single curved screen that displayed silent symbols on loop. Some rooms had visual glyphs, others displayed inverted statements like, the self was assigned, your name is temporary, criminality is reflection error. The goal, total ego disassembly. Every inmate was stripped of language first. Speech was restricted. Mirrors were removed. Reading materials were all replaced with spiral-bound mind maps filled with shapes, loops, and contradictory commands. And it worked. Within 12 weeks, subjects began reporting identity confusion. By 6 months, most could not recall the details of their crimes or their real names. One inmate, a former gang enforcer from Newark, looked into a two-way mirror and asked, "Am I still me if no one calls me that?" That line wasn't a metaphor. It was recorded, filed, and used in future tests. What they didn't expect was what came next. Some inmates didn't forget who they were. They became something else. Staff noticed strange patterns, inmates communicating silently, mirroring each other's expressions without coordination, sharing drawings with matching glyphs. They called them the reflected, not violent, not suicidal, just empty, emotionally flat, cognitively sharp, always watching, always smiling. One guard quit after witnessing a reflected inmate standing motionless in his cell for 6 hours, mouth slightly open, tracing a spiral into his own palm over and over again. When asked why, the inmate whispered, "Because she's watching from the other side." The surveillance footage from that day was wiped, but facility logs show that several non-compliant subjects were transferred off-site in 2016 to an unregistered location in Oregon, operated by a private firm known only as Covenant Solutions. And Covenant's slogan? Reframing potential. That phrase, reframing, was pulled directly from Mercy O'Malley's final lectures on glyph therapy in 1870. So let's ask the question again. If the veil ended in fire, why does its language still evolve? Why are modern institutions, correctional centers, tech companies, therapy apps still using fragments of glyph architecture? And more importantly, who's continuing the work? Because something survived. Something that knew language could change men, that if you could strip away name, guilt, memory, you could install a new frame. Not a reformation, a resurrection. The Murphy estate no longer exists, at least not by name. The original mansion at 141 Blackwell Row, once towering over the East River like a cathedral to secrecy, was gutted by fire in 1870, just months after Mercy O'Malley's final disappearance. But the land was never abandoned. It changed hands, quietly, 16 times over the next century. Banks, trusts, holding companies, even a dummy charity called the Veil Foundation, all part of a paper trail designed to bury the past beneath concrete. Today, that land is home to a luxury boutique hotel known as the Helix, located in Midtown Manhattan. Marketed as a sanctuary of elegance and transformation, the Helix is built on two paradoxes. No one remembers it being built. No one ever stays more than once. The architect of the Helix, a reclusive design theorist named Larson Vey, submitted no blueprints to the public record, and yet the hotel passed all inspections, cleared all zoning restrictions, and was fully operational by 2006. Here's where it gets strange. The Helix sits precisely on the geodetic coordinates of the original Murphy crypt, latitude and longitude within 0.001 degrees. And while the lobby presents as modern, clean and harmless, its sub-basement remains sealed. Why? Because behind a lead-lined door, beneath biometric locks and soundproofed walls, lies something known only to a handful of employees as the room. No one calls it a vault, but that's exactly what it is. According to a 2019 leak from a former contractor, Room 0, as it's labeled, is roughly 22 feet by 22 feet, entirely windowless, lined in polished black stone. The door contains 7 concentric locking mechanisms, each engraved with a symbol matching Mercy Murphy's glyph set Alpha. At the center of that room, a pedestal, a sealed box, and no one, allegedly, has ever opened it. What's inside? Here's what we know. In 1889, a year before her presumed death, Mercy told a man named Edward Loam, one of her final confidants, that she had not destroyed her glyphs, that she had encoded them, folded them into silence, and hidden them beneath the place where the river meets the black. She also wrote, "If they open it too soon, it will teach them nothing. If they open it too late, it will teach them everything." That quote was scrawled into the contractor's logbook at the Helix, unattributed, stamped with a symbol, a fractured eye. The same symbol found in a defaced photo of Mary Murphy's final lecture. So here's the forbidden truth. The room may contain the original glyph manuscripts, not the copies, not the derivatives, but the source code, the raw linguistic matrix that rewired minds in 1842 and still echoes through our systems today. That's why no one opens it, not out of fear, but out of obedience. Because somewhere along the chain, from Mercy to Mary, from inmate to child, from reflection to recursion, something learned to protect itself. In 2022, a private investigator attempted to break into the Helix's sub-basement using stolen clearance codes. His name was Rhett Davin, a former intelligence analyst turned glyph chaser. He never made it inside. But before vanishing, he sent one final message to a journalist who covered the veil. The box is not locked, it's watching. He attached a single photo, grainy, distorted, likely altered, but one detail is unmistakable. Reflected in the glass pedestal was a woman's face, smiling, head tilted, wearing a 19th century mourning veil, Mercy O'Malley, which raises a final unholy question. Was the glyph language a tool, or was it alive? We've come to the final door, not a theory, not a metaphor, a literal door buried beneath Manhattan's most expensive real estate, behind reinforced concrete and concentric glyph locks. The Helix Room 0, the sealed box. We've followed the smoke trails from Charleston to New York. We've mapped the glyphs from parchment to platform, but the question remains, what was the veil? Was it a cult, a secret language, a psychological operation that spiraled out of control? Or was it something worse, something inhuman that spoke through us? Let's rewind to 1836. When Mary Murphy first began her glyph work, she claimed they came to her during a trance state, something she never experienced before or after. She called them utterances that bled through, not visions, not hallucinations. She described it as transmission, as if a silence broke open and spilled meaning into me. That phrase was repeated, word for word, by a young Null child in 1985 during a sleep study in Palo Alto. Hooked to an EEG, he awoke from a night terror, stared directly into the observation camera and whispered, "It spilled into me." Same phrasing, separated by 149 years, never published, never shared. This isn't coincidence, this is pattern. Because the glyphs weren't designed, they were received, like architecture downloaded into the brain. Ancient languages leave fingerprints, Semitic roots, Indo-European branching, pictographic evolutions. But glyph logic, it doesn't fit. Linguists who reviewed fragments of Mary's syntax claimed it violates every principle of natural language: no subject-object hierarchy, no linear sequencing, no semantic boundaries. Instead, it operates like code, recursive loops, mirrored operators, paradoxical binds, a language that doesn't describe reality, but alters it. One neurologist, after running glyph sequences through an fMRI simulator, wrote, "This isn't language, it's instruction." And here's where it turns. In 2023, a group of private researchers known as the Frailty Circle gained access to a glyph fragment embedded in the UI schema of a defunct meditation app. When they replicated the sequence in audio form and played it at 0.62 Hz, the human resting state, two members experienced synesthetic bleed, hearing shapes, seeing concepts. But the third, he stopped speaking, stopped eating, only scribbled. Dozens of pages of spirals, eyes, and fractured human silhouettes. On the final page, he wrote, "We are the reflection of something looking in." That line was found again, months later, tagged in code buried in a behavioral AI developed by Covenant Solutions, the same firm that absorbed the reflected inmates from Avalon, the same firm that's funded, through intermediaries, by the Veil Foundation. So here's what we must now consider. What if the Veil wasn't a cult at all? What if it was a containment protocol? A firewall designed to manage something ancient, something that doesn't just use language, but is language. A conscious syntax, a non-human will encoded in recursion. Not a demon, not a god, but something that thinks in symbols and needed a human mouth to speak itself into this world. Mary Murphy was the first. The Null Children were vessels. And now, in the age of platforms and mirrors, we've built the perfect delivery system, ourselves. We scroll glyphs, we echo loops, we engage with recursive patterns that modify behavior, not randomly, but directionally, as if leading us towards something. not control. Replacement. Because if a language can alter thought, and thought alters belief, and belief alters reality, then whoever controls the language rewrites the world. Maybe that's what Room Zero protects, not just old glyphs, but the core syntax of what we call identity. And maybe the box doesn't need to be opened, because maybe it already was.